Columbus's two faces, navigator of a new world or architect of catastrophe? In the early morning darkness of October 12, 1492, a lookout cried out that he saw land. 3 small ships had crossed an ocean most Europeans feared. Their captain, a stubborn dreamer from Genoa, believed he had reached Asia by sailing west. He had not, but in that mistake, Christopher Columbus changed the world. For centuries, he was celebrated as a heroic explorer, the man who discovered America. In recent decades, he has been condemned as a tyrant, a slave trader, and a destroyer of indigenous civilizations. So who was he? The truth lies not in choosing one face over the other, but in understanding the contradictions that defined him. The geography of error, when desire shapes reality. Columbus did not simply guess that Asia was close. He built his case carefully and selectively. He relied on the calculations of earlier scholars, including the 9th-century astronomer Al-Farghani. But he made a crucial adjustment. He used the shorter Roman mile instead of the longer Arabic mile in his calculations. That subtle change shrank the size of the Earth by nearly a quarter. It was not simple ignorance. It was a kind of early confirmation bias. Columbus wanted Asia to be reachable, so he chose the numbers that made it reachable. Even when physical evidence challenged him, he resisted. On his 3rd voyage, he encountered the enormous outflow of the Orinoco River in South America. The volume of fresh water was so vast that it could only come from a continental landmass. A neutral observer might have concluded, this is not Asia. This is something entirely new. But Columbus could not accept that conclusion. If he had not reached Asia, then his life's mission, his promises to Spain, his religious vision, would unravel. So he insisted he was near the earthly paradise described in Scripture. The tragic irony is striking. The man who opened a new world could not psychologically allow himself to discover one. Master of wind, failure of power. As a navigator, Columbus was extraordinary. He understood the Atlantic wind system known as the Volta do Mar, the circular pattern of trade winds and westerlies that made crossing and returning possible. This was not luck, it was technical brilliance. He knew how to ride the wind gyres of the ocean. But the ocean follows natural laws. People do not. When Columbus returned to the Caribbean on his 2nd voyage in 1493, he was no longer just an explorer. He was a colonial governor. He arrived with 17 ships and around 1,500 men, soldiers, settlers, priests, craftsmen, ready to claim land and extract wealth. Here he faced a storm far more difficult than Atlantic currents. Spanish noblemen expected gold. Settlers expected riches. Many resented taking orders from an Italian outsider of merchant background. Columbus lacked deep political connections within Spain's aristocracy. He ruled by authority granted on paper, not by loyalty earned through alliances. So he turned to severity. His punishments were harsh. Indigenous people who failed to meet gold quotas were mutilated. Rebellions were crushed. Enslavement became common. Spanish settlers who disobeyed him were whipped or executed. This brutality was real. But it was not simply emotional rage. It was also a desperate attempt to maintain order among greedy, mutinous colonists. He mastered the winds of the Atlantic. He failed to master the ambitions of men. The encomienda, bureaucratized exploitation. Columbus's rule introduced a system that would shape the future of empire, the encomienda. This was not slavery in the ancient Roman sense. It was presented as a feudal grant. Spanish settlers were given rights to indigenous labor, in exchange for promises of protection and Christian instruction. In theory, it sounded like guardianship. In practice, it became forced labor. Indigenous communities were compelled to mine gold and work fields under brutal conditions. Tribute quotas were enforced. Thousands were shipped to Spain as slaves. Even more chilling was the legal language used to justify conquest. Spanish explorers would later read aloud a document known as the Requerimiento. It declared that the Pope had granted these lands to Spain if indigenous people did not immediately submit to the church and crown. War and enslavement were considered legally justified. Often, this declaration was read in Spanish. To people who did not understand the language, conquest was not only violent, it was bureaucratic. The cruelty wore the mask of paperwork. The invisible catastrophe, the Great Dying. When we speak of the Columbian exchange, we often mention potatoes, tomatoes, horses, and cattle. But the most powerful exchange was invisible. Disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, illnesses carried unknowingly by Europeans, spread rapidly among indigenous populations who had no immunity. In some regions of the Americas, historians estimate that up to 80 to 90% of the population died within a century of contact. This demographic collapse is sometimes called the Great Dying. Here the moral question becomes complex. Columbus did not understand germ theory. He did not intend biological annihilation. Yet his voyages triggered one of the greatest population collapses in human history. Was he guilty of destruction he could not comprehend? Or was he the catalyst of an inevitable biological collision between isolated hemispheres? The tragedy goes even deeper. The Great Dying did not only kill millions. It reshaped geography. Entire regions were emptied within decades. Forests reclaimed cultivated land. To later European settlers, this depopulated landscape appeared as untouched wilderness. Virgin land, seemingly unclaimed and even divinely prepared. The catastrophe created the illusion of emptiness. And that illusion justified 4 centuries of expansion. Religious zeal or imperial delusion? A superficial portrait shows Columbus as a businessman seeking gold and spices. The deeper portrait reveals something more intense. In his later years, he wrote a collection known as the Book of Prophecies. He believed his voyages were part of a divine plan. He calculated that the wealth from the Indies would help finance a new crusade to retake Jerusalem. He saw himself as chosen. Even his name Christopher, meaning Christ-bearer, carried symbolic weight in his imagination. He believed he was carrying Christianity across the ocean, as part of sacred history. Within the medieval legal framework of just war, resistance to Christian authority could justify enslavement. Conversion and domination were fused together. Columbus did not think of himself as evil. He thought of himself as righteous. That is what makes him historically unsettling. A hinge in history. Columbus died in 1506 still believing he had reached the edges of Asia. He never fully understood that he had connected 2 separate hemispheres and launched a new global age. He was brilliant enough to sail across the Atlantic, rigid enough not to recognize a continent, devout enough to believe he served God, blind enough to unleash catastrophe. If we call him a hero, we ignore the suffering. If we call him a villain, we ignore the transformation. A deeper understanding recognizes something more profound. Columbus was a hinge in history. Through him, medieval faith collided with emerging capitalism. Navigation technology outran moral philosophy. Global integration began without global ethics. Hinges do not choose the doors they open. But once opened, those doors cannot easily be closed. Christopher Columbus was not simply a great navigator. He was the beginning of a new world and the beginning of its deepest wounds.
It's time to study new words in context. 1. Lookout. Definition: a person whose job is to watch carefully for danger or something important. Example: the lookout on the ship shouted when he saw land far away. 2. Indigenous. Definition: people who originally lived in a place before others came. Example: the indigenous people of the island had lived there for many generations. 3. Contradiction. Definition: a situation where 2 ideas or actions do not match or oppose each other. Example: it was a contradiction that he wanted peace but kept starting fights. 4. Bias. Definition. A strong opinion that makes someone unfair in their judgment. Example. The judge tried to make a fair decision without any bias. 5. Unravel. Definition. To slowly fall apart or become unclear after being organized. Example. His plan began to unravel when people stopped supporting him. 6. Westerlies. Definition. Winds that blow from the west toward the east. Example. Sailors used the westerlies to travel back toward Europe. 7. Gyres. Definition. Large circular movements of wind or ocean water. Example. Ships moved along the ocean gyres to travel across the Atlantic. 8. Aristocracy. Definition. The group of powerful and wealthy people in the highest social class. Example. The aristocracy owned large lands and had great influence in the kingdom. 9. Severity. Definition. Harshness or strictness in behavior or punishment. Example. The teacher spoke with severity when the students broke the rules. 10. Quota. Definition. A fixed amount that must be reached or completed. Example. The workers had to meet their gold quota every week. 11. Mutilated. Definition. Badly injured by cutting off or damaging a body part. Example. The cruel punishment left some victims mutilated. 12. Mutinous. Definition. Refusing to obey leaders and rebelling against authority. Example. The sailors became mutinous and refused to follow the captain's orders. 13. Encomienda. Definition. A system in Spanish colonies where settlers were given control over indigenous workers. Example. Under the encomienda system, many indigenous people were forced to work in mines. 14. Feudal grant. Definition. Land or rights given by a ruler to someone in return for service or loyalty. Example. The king gave the knight a feudal grant of land for his help in war. 15. Requerimiento. Definition. A statement read by Spanish explorers telling indigenous people to obey Spain and the church. Example. The soldiers read the requerimiento before attacking the village. 16. Demographic. Definition. Relating to the number and types of people in a population. Example. The disease caused a huge demographic change in the region. 17. Annihilation. Definition. Complete destruction of people or things. Example. The city faced annihilation after the powerful attack. 18. Catalyst. Definition. Something that causes a big change or event to happen. Example. The new discovery became a catalyst for many scientific studies. 19. Hemispheres. Definition. The two halves of the Earth divided by the equator. Example. Trade connected the eastern and western hemispheres. 20. Zeal. Definition. Strong excitement and passion for something. Example. She worked with great zeal to help the poor. 21. Fused. Definition. Joined or combined together to form one thing. Example. The artist fused music and painting into one performance. 22. Unsettling. Definition. Making people feel worried, uneasy, or uncomfortable. Example. The dark silence of the forest was unsettling. 23. Rigid. Definition. Very strict and not willing to change ideas or rules. Example. His rigid thinking made it hard for him to accept new ideas.
Comprehension questions. 1. What happened on October 12, 1492? Answer. A lookout on Columbus's ship saw land after the long journey across the Atlantic Ocean. 2. What was Columbus trying to find when he sailed west? Answer. He wanted to find a faster sea route to Asia, to trade for spices and other valuable goods. 3. Why did Columbus believe Asia was closer than it really was? Answer. He miscalculated the size of the Earth and used numbers that made the distance seem shorter. 4. What important natural evidence suggested that Columbus had found a new continent? Answer. The huge amount of fresh water flowing from the Orinoco River suggested that the land was a large continent, not an island. 5. What navigation skill helped Columbus successfully cross the Atlantic Ocean? Answer. He understood the Atlantic wind patterns called the Volta do Mar, 6. Why did Columbus struggle as a governor in the Caribbean? Answer. Many Spanish settlers expected gold and riches, and they did not respect Columbus as their leader. 7. What was the encomienda system? Answer. It was a system where Spanish settlers were given control over indigenous labor in return for protecting and teaching them Christianity. 8. What was the requerimiento? Answer. It was a document Spanish explorers read to indigenous people, demanding that they accept the authority of the Spanish king and the church. 9. Why was the requerimiento unfair to indigenous people? Answer. It was often read in Spanish to people who did not understand the language. 10. What was the Columbian exchange? Answer. It was the exchange of plants, animals, goods, diseases, and ideas between the Old World and the New World. 11. Which invisible factor caused the most damage during the Columbian exchange? Answer. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza. 12. What was the Great Dying? Answer. It was the massive population decline of indigenous people in the Americas after contact with Europeans. 13. How did the Great Dying affect the land in the Americas? Answer. Many regions became empty, which made later settlers think the land was unused wilderness. 14. What religious belief motivated Columbus in his later years? Answer. He believed his discoveries were part of God's plan and could help fund a new crusade. 15. What book did Columbus write to explain his religious beliefs? Answer. He wrote the Book of Prophecies. 16. Why did Columbus never realize he had discovered a new continent? Answer. He believed until his death that he had reached the edge of Asia. 17. Why do some people see Columbus as a hero? Answer. Because his voyages connected the continents and helped begin a new global age. 18. Why do others criticize Columbus strongly? Answer. Because of the violence, forced labor, and suffering experienced by indigenous people after his arrival. 19. What does the article say Columbus became in history? Answer. It describes him as a hinge in history, meaning his actions opened the door to major global changes. 20. Why is Columbus's legacy considered complicated? Answer. Because his achievements helped shape the modern world, but they also led to great suffering and destruction